Hey guys, good morning and welcome to another episode of Right Politics. I was going to post this video 2 days ago, and then I heard news that federal troops were going to be withdrawn from Portland, Oregon, and then this morning I saw that the withdrawal was going to be paused. But basically I made a series of videos to show why federal troops should not withdraw from Portland, Oregon, because they are there to protect federal property, and federal property is supposed to be protected by these federal officers if local law enforcement cannot. Or in this case of Portland, Oregon, they will not protect them because the mayor's a Democrat. And also, it's one of those things where the safety of American property is their number one concern. And these protesters tried taking down the fence in front of this courthouse time and time again, and it's one of those things. And I also wanted to say that these federal officers are extremely brave and loyal because they have been facing blindness from protesters and rioters shining lasers in their eyes. And it was kind of comedic because I was watching this program where they were questioning the attorney general, and they were asking, is it normal for these federal officers to experience blindness and being burnt on their skin? And they said, of course it's not normal. And I think that the question was very sarcastic and basically not in touch with reality at all, because normally in a society you do not have rioters trying to destroy federal officers' person. So I want for you to see these videos. There's 3, and just watch them in sequence, and it will basically unravel the picture that is supposed to be painted of why these guys are not an occupying force like Democrats claim, but they are actually to save everything we stand for in this nation.
Waiting for somebody to explain to me how this makes sense. Nobody's been able to do it yet. Nobody's explained to me why this makes sense. Can you tell me? From here? Yes. I'm from here. Now, Chicago, this might make sense. Ferguson, Missouri, this might make sense. How does this make sense in Oregon?
Mr. Secretary, there is an ongoing issue 2 months now in Portland, Oregon, where rioters every night go out and just create havoc. Your folks are there to protect the federal buildings. The mayor, the governor there say, you guys don't have any place to be there. You ought to get out. Why do you say, but we should be there? How do you respond to their insistence that federal police officers, leave?
Well, again, we're there to enforce federal law. And as you know, we don't do that by invitation. No other federal law enforcement agency does that by invitation. We need to make sure that we enforce federal law 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So in Portland, we are specifically there to guard federal properties, specifically a federal courthouse. It's the seat of justice there in Portland. And what we know is that courthouse has been targeted for 55 nights straight in a row. Violent criminals are attacking that courthouse and attacking law enforcement officers. We put up a perimeter around the courthouse recently. They have merged last night and the night before with power tools, trying to pull the fence over with vehicles. They are lobbing Molotov cocktails and other explosive devices inside the fence line, targeting law enforcement officers. So very, very violent, but the Department of Homeland Security is resolute in protecting that facility. We'll continue to do that because that's the job Congress gave us. It directs the Department of Homeland Security and specifically the Secretary to protect all federal properties. And we do this across the country. We protect almost 9,000 federal properties. But unfortunately, Portland is the only city where we're having this issue because we're not getting the full support of the local and state law enforcement or leaders directing their law enforcement not to fully support us. And that's very, very troubling.
I would have to think that in the offline conversations that your officers are having with local and state police agencies, they can't be happy that they've been told to stand down and allow these people just to do whatever they wish. Do those conversations happen? And is there great frustration on the part of local law enforcement when they're told to just look the other way at anarchy?
I believe there is. Again, our individual officers, Federal Protective Service there on the ground in Portland, obviously has personal relationships with other law enforcement there. So they're trying to coordinate as best they can. But again, Portland is making it very, very difficult. What they have done recently, the city council has passed a resolution telling Portland Police Department that they cannot support, they cannot coordinate with federal law enforcement officials in the city of Portland. And as you know, you cannot be a fan of the administration, that's fine. But when you're directing specific actions like that, that becomes very dangerous for law enforcement.
You brought up a very important point, and that is that it's fine to have policy differences. You can have political differences, and those are historic. My gosh, I had them when I was governor for 11 years in a state at that time, heavily, overwhelmingly Democratic. But when a crisis came, everybody put politics aside. There were no parties. It was all hands on deck. Let's solve a problem. I don't understand this new thinking of putting politics above public safety, and I'm having a hard time understanding the justification for it. But I don't see this ending well if something doesn't change.
What we have in other cities is if federal property is targeted, what we have is that relationship between the federal, state, and local law enforcement to address that situation, to investigate, to arrest individuals, charge those, and indict them. And we just don't have that support in Portland. It's unfortunate, and it's really causing a very dangerous situation there in Portland. And I talk about that point because it's important. Whether we go to Seattle, whether we go to Chicago or anywhere else, we have that support with local law enforcement when it comes to protecting federal buildings. We don't have that in Portland. What we see every night between about midnight and 5 a.m. is anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000 violent criminals taking matters into their own hand, attacking a federal building and then stepping back across the street, rearming, redeploying, and doing it over and over, night after night, hour after hour. And something needs to change. We need the state, we need the local law enforcement officials to say enough is enough, work with us. We can address this situation in a matter of hours. We just need to be able to do that in partnership with them.
When you arrest some of the leaders of these mobs, and that's what they are, these aren't protesters, these are mobs, violent anarchists, and they go to prison for 10 years, it seems like that's the only thing that might be a reasonable deterrence when some of these folks who just look at this as a recreational activity realize they could lose 10 years of their life in a federal prison over this. And I don't care what federal prison, that ain't pleasant.
It's exactly what we're doing. We're really pushing our Department of Justice colleagues, both the U.S. Attorney there as well as the FBI and others, to not only investigate, but to make those arrests and to prosecute. So since July 4th, which is where we see the big uptick in criminal activity there in Portland, we've made over 60 arrests, and we'll continue to do that. We're going to continue to hold criminals accountable for their criminal actions. And again, because we don't have that partnership there in Portland, the federal government is having to do that all on their own, which I think is very different than any other city in the country.
Mr. Secretary, before I let you go, a personal note. Happy anniversary to you and your wife, who celebrate your wedding anniversary this week. And I'm sure she has not seen you in a long time. I hope she recognizes you with or without a mask. Good luck and thank you for being with us. It's a pleasure to have you back.
Well, welcome to this edition of the 700 Club. Rampant violence in the streets of America. The city of Portland is now in its 8th week of anarchy, with rioting in Austin, Texas, Aurora, Colorado, Seattle, Washington, and many more. Well, what's happened to law and order in America? George Thomas brings us this.
Early this morning, hundreds of demonstrators continue to stage protests outside the federal courthouse in Portland, Oregon. Police deploying tear gas and flashbangs to keep protesters off federal property as violent confrontations between activists and law enforcement entered its 8th week. In one park not too far from the protest, they discovered a bag full of loaded rifle magazines and Molotov cocktails.
Have us actually get somewhere with all these protests. You know, people are trying to go for systemic change.
Early Sunday, thousands took to the streets of Portland and more than half a dozen other cities across the country. Protests often turning from peaceful to chaotic, even fatal. On Saturday, a driver arrested after he allegedly shot and killed a man after driving through a protest in Austin, Texas. Video captured at the scene shows dozens of people running for cover as multiple gunshots ring out.
Initial reports indicate the victim may have been carrying a rifle and approached suspect vehicle. Suspect was in the vehicle and shot at the victim. What was that?
In Aurora, Colorado, one person is shot and another injured as a person plows his Jeep into a crowd demonstrating against police brutality. In Seattle, hours after protesters set fire to a youth detention center, police and demonstrators clash on the streets, authorities there declaring a riot. In Oakland, California, the Alameda County Superior Courthouse set on fire Saturday evening by protesters. And in Richmond, Virginia, police using chemical agents after a crowd attacks officers with rocks, batteries, and other objects. All this coming as the White House threatens to send more federal agents to cities across the country gripped by weeks of violent protests. George Thomas, CBN News.
Well, should we be shocked at the destruction of our cities? Well, maybe not, because this chaos has been decades in the making. So who's really behind it? Dale Hurd has this story.
America has had riots before, but never have they seemed to have the approval of a major political party. Portland's Democratic Mayor Ted Wheeler even thanked protesters who have been destroying his town before he was hit with tear gas. What makes this a potentially dangerous revolutionary moment in U.S. history is that many of America's elites either tolerate or support the rioting and the burning of U.S. cities.
There are always people who are willing to burn and to loot and to tear things apart. Now those people are getting support from the news media, from the academy, and to a large degree from the Democrat Party.
How did we reach this point? Writer and commentator Andrew Klavan says decades of cultural rot and leftist indoctrination.
We have 50 years, maybe close to 60 years, pouring this disinformation, this American disinformation, into the minds of our populace and our young. I don't see what the surprise is when out and they say, oh, America is a terrible country, it's a racist country. America was founded on racism. That's what the New York Times is putting out.
The way these operations work is there will be a mass of people who have a grievance, and they will be weaponized by a small cadre, or not so small cadre of organizers.
Diana West, author of The Red Thread, says this is how revolutions start. And this revolution didn't start this year.
This is another cycle of a long march through the institution, long efforts to overthrow the Western world, overthrow the American Constitution.
Elizabeth Rogliani had to flee Venezuela with her family when Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro used racial politics to turn South America's wealthiest nation into a poor socialist dictatorship. She has a warning for Americans.
I have already lived through this thing when I was living in Venezuela. Statues came down. Chavez didn't want that history displayed. And then he changed the street names. Then came the curriculum. Then some movies couldn't be shown on certain TV channels. You need to guard your country and your society or it will be destroyed.
President Trump is threatening to yank funding for schools and colleges he says are about radical left indoctrination, not education. The violence has now spread to churches, and Americans are getting a fresh education on the concept that ideas have consequences. Dale Hurd, CBN News.
It's amazing, folks. We cannot enslave an educated people, but our children aren't educated. So one study, for example, in Texas, at least 40% of the students couldn't name the other country to the south of Texas. They couldn't even name Mexico. A lot of students in Florida couldn't find their state on a map. They couldn't name the states that, and they certainly knew nothing about the Constitution. They knew nothing about the Declaration of Independence. And they've been fed this lie over and over again by their teachers that America is racist, that it was founded on racism, and this recent 1619 movement that America really started when we were importing the first slaves, and that we are a racist, terrible country. I mean, this is a lie that's being put out week after week after week. It used to be, I was reading that the primary means of instruction of our nation over the years was the McGuffey Reader. And McGuffey brought in portions of scripture and teachings over and over again, so the school children were taught the Bible, they were taught to love each other, they were taught to live in harmony, and they were taught the virtues of this country. We're not taught that any longer, and our schools are breeding grounds of hatred and revolution against this country. And so kids leave school, either they can't read and they can't write and they can't spell and they can't function, or they're taught revolutionary ideas. And so don't be surprised. I was listening today, apparently in our state of Richmond, Virginia, there are mobs that have come in to go after Virginia Commonwealth University, breaking windows and doing damage. And there are kids from the city of Hopewell, the city of, just south of Richmond, that are coming up against the state capitol. But this is going all across the country, a revolution. And it's been building, as Dale said, for almost 50 years. What are we going to do about it? We'd better wake up or we'll lose our country. You know, when you go back and look at what happened in Russia, it took about 17,000 people to overcome the Tsarist regime and bring in Bolshevism. Well, what did the Nazis do? They demonized the Jews. They had Kristallnacht, where they tore up Jewish houses and places of business. And then the next thing you know, the Jews were evil, and then away you've got Hitler, and you've got the awful regime that took the lives of 50 million people.
All right, guys, be sure to share, like, and subscribe, and we'll see you on another episode of Right Politics.